Alright, hello everyone, and welcome back to Magic Meatball Marauder. My name is Jakuya, and I'm here to talk about the deck win archetypes of EDH or Commander. Now, I have to mention why I'm even discussing this in the first place, is because I think it's really helpful in terms of like whenever you're playing like brackets or even just like playing in your LGS without like brackets. It's very important to have somewhat of our rule zero conversation, but making it easy by just saying, hey, this is what or how my deck wins. It's very important to kind of like define your deck in like the archetypes so people kind of know what you're going to be throwing at them or what they have to deal with. So it makes it easier for them to kind of like select the decks that would be appropriate, against like your deck, for example. Now, it's important to note that decks in general can have more than one of these archetypes. So usually it's like at least two archetypes for each of the decks that you create. And the big one, the very big one, is that certain archetypes definitely fall under certain brackets based on how casual and or how, not so casual they are. So without further ado, let me just dive right in and tell you what are the different ones. The first one we start with is the most ubiquitous type of deck, which I would call the beatdown deck. This is the most straightforward type of deck that you can have, which is just creatures and beat your opponents down to 0 life. There's different ways to do this. You can either go like Voltron on your commander, you can go like a go wide like weenie strategy, you can also do like big boys, you can make them bigger. There's different ways to do the beatdown deck, but if your deck really is just focused on like hammering somebody down to 0 life, you have a beatdown deck. These decks are found typically in like bracket 1 all the way to bracket 4. You're not going to find any beatdown decks in bracket 5 because everyone there is playing combos. But you can definitely, have a degree of success there. In lower brackets, beatdown decks tend to be like slower. It takes a little bit to build up a win, but in like higher bracket decks, decks like beatdown decks are going to be like a lot more explosive. Just creatures just get big out of nowhere and just hit you. Like you'll start to see more like Crater Hoof type effects in like higher brackets like that. So the next archetype I want to talk about is what I call the Singe archetype. And these decks are typically focused on pinging your opponents to death with effects. And a lot of the things that fall under here are like ETB burn effects like Impact Tremors or, like Perforos. You can do like Cast Trigger burn with like VV Ornithir or like specific, Gearson Starn. You have Aristocrats. I know, like, Drain kind of doesn't fit in with the fiery Singe thing I'm talking about here, but it all falls under the same archetype of Drain, and even rarely Poison, right? If you're using a deck that slowly applies poison on your opponents, then you would fall under a Singe deck. Singe decks are typically found in bracket 2 to bracket 4. In lower brackets, Singe decks are very, very slow, so you're probably pinging somebody like once, maybe twice per turn, so it's like a really, really slow burn. In higher brackets, it just keeps going. You might be burning people for like a large quarter of their life, so it's very possible. For you to get some really crazy damage in like much higher brackets, but typically found in like bracket 2 to bracket 4. The next archetype is what I would call the value decks. Now, this doesn't seem like a win archetype, but trust me, like being able to just simply outvalue your opponents and then they just can't match, and while they run out of stuff, you're still generating things over the course of a game. You can win just by that. These value decks typically rely on like card advantage engines, so you typically create like a combo where you put a couple of permanents down that really work well together. This is something that generates you cards, like permanents. Maybe you put like counters on your guys. So it's a very wide net, and you typically find this all from bracket 2 all the way to bracket 5. Bracket 2 decks typically are just or like low bracket stuff will typically have like very small, minute effects, like, oh, when this happens, draw a card. Whereas in much higher bracket decks, the card advantage is ridiculous. You get some ridiculous amount of card draw. Your permanents just swarm the field for some reason, so it's really crazy. But that's the value archetype here. Now, the next one is what I would call choke decks. Now, these decks are more focused on like locking your opponents out of the game, like slowly. It takes a little bit to get there, but once you lock them down, you basically just stop them from doing anything, and then that's it, right? Like, you just win because they can't do anything. Decks that fall under this category are mostly like stacks decks, or decks that really focus on like locking your opponent. There's commanders out there that prevent your opponents from doing something. Even that would fall, would technically work. For choke decks, I would say that they typically start at bracket 3 and go all the way to bracket 5. I don't think they fall under bracket 2 because choke decks are way too nasty to play in the casual pod, especially when you're reliably like locking people out. This archetype goes all the way up to bracket 5, so like in lower brackets it takes a little bit, or even like a mid bracket like bracket 3, it takes a little bit for you to like lock everyone down and people will see it happen. In bracket 5, there's just like decks that just say lands can't untap, get wrecked, sorry, so that's something you'll have to deal with when you're going up on the bracket. So choke decks, pretty nasty. The next archetype is something that only exists in EDH because of the multiplayer format, and these are what I call bait decks. These are decks that either incentivize or force your opponents into attacking one another. Now, decks that do these are typically like goad decks or politic decks that, and it's the way you win is that your opponents weaken themselves by fighting amongst themselves to such an extent where you could just like sweep everyone, or you try to win the 1v1 after your 3 opponents have essentially like taken each other out. These types of decks are typically found in like bracket I wouldn't say bracket 1, actually. I'm gonna change this. They should be bracket 2 to about like bracket 4. I wouldn't say that bait decks can get way up there because this this archetype is still very combat focused, and combat focused archetypes don't really make it all the way to bracket 5, but it's still a good type of archetype, and it's one of the rarer ones that I see like people playing. Finally, and this is I think one of the most important archetypes to define, these decks I call clock decks. Now, why do I call them clock decks? Because while the deck is still running, and while your opponent who's piloting that deck is still on the table, still alive, right, and still playing, they're eventually gonna win over time, right? Like, they're just eventually gonna get themselves into a win if no one stops you, right? So these decks are typically like infinite combo decks, like Thoracle decks, basically any deck that focuses on getting a particular like combo out to just defeat everyone. Now, looking back from the clock deck and all these other archetype decks, you can have a clock deck that's mixed with any of these, and typically clock decks are pretty dang strong, if I would say so myself. I think that if once your deck can get to this point, it's typically at bracket 3 and it goes all the way to bracket 5. And here's a very important thing to note as well. Every single CDH deck out there is a clock deck, right? This is the big one. So that's why it's called a clock deck, because if you're playing this with this archetype, it's like you hear the ticking of like a clock. Every turn that this person is allowed to stay on board, they're gonna eventually win, right? So typically I would say like clock deck players are typically like it's best to like take them out, but immediately. But that's just me being biased. So that was just a very quick overview of each of these like deck win archetypes. My plan for the future is to actually do deck techs, and in those deck techs I will very clearly define each of these each of those decks into whichever categories like these that they fall into. And yeah, that's basically it for the win archetypes of EDH. I hope people who tuned in and watched this found something informative. And again, thank you so much to whoever's like watching this, and you go have a great day there. So until then, I'm gonna peace out.